Good morning, friends of St. Paul's. Today is Wednesday, August 5th, and we are going to hear from 1 Kings chapter 19. I have entitled this devotion, The Sound of Silence, one of my favorite songs. Perhaps you love that song as well. And I thought we might spend a little time with this story, and then we're going to try something together this week. So, from 1 Kings chapter 19, at that place Elijah came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" This week I thought we might spend a little time with this first reading, this special story, something that has often been entitled The Still Small Voice. The NRSV calls this the sound of sheer silence, where God is present. But when you were a child, or if you read a different translation, you may have heard this as God's presence in a still, small voice. In my first call, my colleague was really invested in mindfulness practices. They helped him grow in his identity as a Christian and in his discipleship and spirituality. And one of the gifts that he offered me was the practice of sitting in silence. My colleague would often spend several minutes each day sitting with a timer quietly in a space all alone. He taught me that this might be a time of peace and a time to notice your breath, not to control it, and simply to be in the presence of God and yourself. In this story from 1 Kings, Elijah is very afraid. Some scary things have happened to him. He's been in a showdown with the prophets of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel's kingdom, the prophets of Baal, and he is on the lam. So Elijah comes to this cave and he's hiding there, very afraid. And God's voice comes to him and says, "I'm about to pass by." In the midst of so much fear and upheaval, Elijah may have imagined that God's passing by would be another show of might, the way that God had shown up for Elijah against the prophets or in other areas of his ministry to this point. Elijah probably expected that God would be present in something like a wind or an earthquake or a fire. God had just shown up in a fire on an altar against the Baal prophets. But instead, God shows up in the sound of sheer silence, is what our author tells us. There are so many ways that we experience God, and one of the ways that I often encourage our congregation to think about experiencing God is considering the characteristics of God, that God is creative, that God is loving, that God is forgiving, that God is gracious, all the things that we know to be true about our Creator, and then to recognize those things among your community, to recognize who it is that's forgiving or loving or creative. That's a really helpful way to notice God's presence in our lives. But this week, I want to encourage you to consider silence as a way that God shows up to us. We firmly believe that God is always coming near to us and meeting us where we are. And so I want to encourage you to try, maybe just one time this week, maybe if you like it, every day, to turn a timer on, maybe on your phone or on your oven or your microwave, wherever it is that you keep a timer that you like to use, for 3 minutes. Sit somewhere that you can plant your feet on the ground, maybe a chair, maybe sit on the ground and ground your sits bones, as they say in yoga, down into the ground, and just be quiet for 3 minutes. Your timer will tell you when it's over. If you want to set a longer time, you could do 5 or even 10 minutes, and just notice how you feel. Notice your breath and notice what it is about God that might be revealed to you in the sound of sheer silence. The Bible is filled with examples of how people experience God's presence, and some of them are very hard for us to incorporate into our lives. I don't know about you, but God's voice has never woken me from a dream calling out, "Delaney, Delaney," and sent me to check in with Eli. But the sound of sheer silence is something that is available to us in a way that we can recognize something about God in a way that God has shown up to others in our lineage of faith in the past. And so, my friends, this week I encourage you to incorporate some quiet into your life and just notice what grows.